It is the message of the Golden Rule, to love thy neighbour as thyself, and it is inspired by the understanding that we are all the children of God. However, everything is not all rosy and theoretical. I perceive a number of significant threats to the maintenance of liberty today. I'm going to highlight 3 areas that illustrate our complex and ongoing struggle in defence of liberty. First are the threats to our natural environment. Second, the challenges facing the international community. And third, infringements of liberty by our state and federal governments. Whatever people may argue about global warming, international whaling, deforestation or anything else, we need to observe the precautionary principle. We cannot indefinitely plunder the resources and alter the environment of the planet without consequence. We are merely transitory custodians of this planet, and to deplete our natural environment leaves future generations with an impaired quality of life. Food security, energy security, fresh water and clean air are surely necessary for the maintenance of a decent quality of life. Liberty cannot flourish amid chronic and debilitating poverty. Lifting people out of poverty has been one of the mightiest triumphs of an economic system predicated on personal liberty and the ability to create personal wealth. Aspiration must be rewarded. It is my strong belief that only through increased wealth creation and innovative renewable energy technology we will be able to move our civilization towards environmental sustainability. Equally, liberty is essential for a society that must meet head-on the complex challenge of global disease. From where have the great advances in medicine and public health come? They have come from free societies where the liberty of people to think and experiment has led to global benefit. It's no coincidence, for example, that the most significant advances to both eradicate and treat HIV have come from the West. The contribution of the West is not limited to Google, Coke and Hollywood. However, freedom and liberty empower innovation and investment. The goals and achievements we have are much desired in countries. Globalisation is a derivative of the success of liberty. Globalisation also represents the great potential of economic liberty. The breakdown of tariff walls, which restricted individuals and companies from trading, the internationalisation of the labour force, and the reform of failed centrally controlled economies has delivered wealth to large portions of the world's population. We rightly paused during the recent financial crisis to rein in the excesses and address some of the flaws in the global financial system. But the shock of recent events has not diminished in any way my faith in either market forces or the positive power of a globalised economy. Wealth, of course, should never be the sole indicator of progress. However, globalisation and the economic growth it is delivering to developing nations is the most effective poverty reduction program in operation. For example, between 1990 and 2015, the World Bank estimates that the number of people living on less than $1.25 a day will halve, from 1.8 billion people to 950 million people. Internationally, we have come to an understanding arising from the horrors of 2 world wars and genocidal experiences in places like Cambodia and Rwanda, that free nations have a responsibility to stand up for liberty of all oppressed and threatened peoples across the globe. Interventions in East Timor and Kosovo were expressions of the determination of free nations to ensure the liberty of others. Liberty and freedom are not merely Western concepts or constructions. They are universal. Of course, today the immediate challenge is our response to the threat of terrorism. This is a global and a domestic threat. The rise of religious extremist movements and their expressed belief that only violence can lead to justice, a proposition refuted by the examples of Gandhi, Mandela and Martin Luther King, represents a clear challenge to societies. Our response should be to enhance and expand liberty, not to curtail it. This is as important locally as it is globally. As a liberal, a legislator and a lawyer, it is the anti-terrorism laws enacted by a government of which I was a member that has given me great cause to reflect on our individual rights. Are there occasions, I ask, in which the welfare of the majority warrants the restriction of the rights of the few? It is one of the challenges that we face in seeking to apply Mills's principles. In this case, the Australian government, like its counterparts elsewhere, was responding to terrorism threats that potentially put the lives of thousands at risk. But did the solution also have the potential to limit the freedoms we hold so precious? Under normal circumstances, much of the powers conferred on enforcement agencies by the Act are ones that I would be horrified to see in any democratic advance. In particular, I make mention of preventative detention without charge that severely limits access to legal assistance or even outside communication, control orders that limit movement and may be enforced for up to 10 years, and expanded police stop, search and interrogation powers. However, I reached the conclusion that the threat to liberty of so many justified the actions we took against so few. When effectively the whole polity is under threat from attack by people determined to bring it down, then the government's primary responsibility is to secure the safety of its citizens. These are, in my view, wartime measures. If the nation was under immediate threat of invasion, I suspect that debate and concern would have been more muted. However, the war against terrorism is far less tangible. It's like a guerrilla war, where the enemy is not as easily discernible. What is important? But what if the war against terrorism is to last a lifetime? The government's recent white paper, released last month, concluded there is no end point in sight. Do these laws effectively stay on the statute books forever because the threat of terrorism will persist for generations to come? It is my own view that the loss of individual liberty that these laws represent cannot stand for all time. What we must do is objectively, dispassionately and regularly review their efficacy, preferably, and I think this is very possible, in a bipartisan way. If we find the laws have not been used or have not been needed, then they should be repealed. I would not find it acceptable to declare a situation an emergency one day and then declare it permanent the next. And this brings me to other threats to our freedoms that are much closer to home. Some of these come from our own political leaders. They may seem trivial when you look at them individually, but add them all up and you see that the liberty we've fought so hard for is starting to fray at the edges. For example, there was a recent suggestion that the drinking age be raised to 21. Yes, we have a problem with binge drinking, and yes, this should be a cause for concern. But if you are old enough to fight for your country, if you are old enough to vote, if you are old enough to be tried in a criminal court as an adult, then you are an adult. And the concept of telling someone who is 18, 19 or 20 that they are prohibited from consuming alcohol is an infringement of individual liberty that goes way too far. When the police in New South Wales suggested banning the sale of full-strength alcohol on Australia Day, not one politician bought into the debate, despite this being an obvious direct attack on liberty. It was not accepted because it was clearly a ridiculous proposal. I mean, for example, people would just go home and drink or take the alcohol out into the street. But few people hear the police call for less regulation and greater personal responsibility. Similarly, we see the current federal government seeking to introduce laws that will effectively censor the internet. Of course, we all want to stop unlawful material being viewed on the internet. There are appropriate protections that are in place for that. But I have personal responsibility as a parent. If I want to stop my children from viewing other material that I feel is inappropriate, then that is my responsibility as a parent to do something about it, not that of the government. And this was the view of the Howard government, which proposed PC-based internet filters, a policy which I have always strongly supported. What we have in the government's internet filtering proposals is a scheme that is unworkable in practice. But more perniciously, it is a scheme that will create the infrastructure for government censorship on a broader scale. Protecting liberty is about protecting freedoms against both known and future threats. Some may argue that we can surely trust a democratically elected government in Australia to never try to introduce more widespread censorship. I'm not so sure. We would all like to think that liberty in Australia does not need defending. However, warning bells must surely have started clanging when the South Australian Labor government sought, in a ham-fisted and ultimately unsuccessful way recently, to actually censor political bloggers on the internet in the lead up to their current election. Perhaps such proposals for wanting back liberty are not surprising from a Labor Party that argues for an ever-expanding role for government in the affair of our nations and our personal lives. I don't mean to suggest that there is no room for government intervention and regulation. There is probably a legitimate debate to be had about the controls, for example, via the classification system placed on extremely violent video games. I heard a compelling interview on ABC Radio recently on this subject. Dr. Wayne Warburton, a psychologist at Macquarie University, was explaining how repeated exposure to violent games can influence the behaviour of their users. In contrast to watching a violent movie on the odd occasion, spending hours embedded in a game, actually pulling the trigger and killing virtual people that are now so realistic that fantasy and reality have merged, and it can rewire our brains. What concerns me about these games is that they, at the most benign end, make us immune to violence, or worse still, encourage us to think of violence as a legitimate tool. Fundamentally, the loss of respect for human life and dignity that these games encourage becomes a threat to the respect we have for individual liberty. In other areas such as DNA testing, data matching, credit history and mobile phone tracking, we must be ever vigilant to prevent the punishment of the few becoming the entrapment of the many. Huxley's Brave New World morphs from fiction into frightening fact, all by little increments, and all in the name of just a little more security. But as Benjamin Franklin said, and I quote, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." In addition to this, we should be concerned about the rapid proliferation of CCTV cameras across our cities. Whilst they may be acceptable in crime hotspots, do we really want to go down the path of Great Britain and find it impossible to travel any street without being recorded by the government or the police on video? Even in my local area, CCTV was set up to protect the welfare of revenue-raising parking meters from vandals, but they have inadvertently provided a viewing platform of the local community going about its business. Even when they should be helpful, these CCTVs, such as during a recent bombing of TIO offices in Darwin, the police were allegedly using the cameras for inappropriate and unrelated purposes. In every state and territory, there is an endless and rarely challenged demand for the expansion of police powers, taken to extremes in Western Australia, with a proposal to allow virtually unrestricted stop and search powers for police. I understand that similar proposals have also won favour here in Victoria. Surely the Australian interpretation of liberty extends to the right of an individual to go about their daily business without being subject to a random body search by police. The police do not have to declare a reason for the random body search. In my view, this goes too far. Finally, I wanted to briefly touch on the issue of a Bill of Rights. The government has before it the report of the Grattan Committee, which recommends a Human Rights Act. The Federal Coalition has indicated its opposition to such a bill, a position I support. My concerns about a Human Rights Act lay in the power and authority that such an act would give to the judiciary. Such responsibilities would be both undemocratic and ultimately undermine the independence of the courts. I referred earlier in my speech to the conflict that often occurs between different human rights. Many, if not all, involve contestable propositions that fall outside the usual role of judges to interpret the law through the prism of legal principles. They are essentially political rather than legal judgments. For example, the courts could be asked to judge whether a law that bans tobacco advertising infringes free speech. This is not a legal issue, but it is one that should fall within the responsibility of democratically elected legislators to determine. Judges are not elected. They do not necessarily represent the diverse range of views in society that an elected parliamentarian can. And they are not subject to the scrutiny and accountability of parliamentarians. You will, very appropriately, never find judges fronting doorstops or public meetings to justify their decisions. I also fear that by burdening the courts with such a role, the work will undermine the integrity and independence of the judiciary. I am a true believer in the separation of powers. If courts are making findings on contestable and essentially political issues, politicians and those in the community who support the actions of the Parliament will find themselves criticising their findings. Unwittingly, judges will find themselves players rather than arbiters and be the subject of the full weight of public opinion, public scrutiny and public sanction. There are better ways to guarantee human rights. Fundamentally, our institutions are sound, and those features of the Australian polity that I referred to earlier guarantee that we can and do, by large measure, ensure that human rights are protected. Ultimately, it is what beats in the hearts of Australians that forms the best protection of all. Our desire for a fair go, our healthy scepticism, our belief in self-reliance, diversity, and our multicultural society are the values that have guided Australia's development. They cannot be taken for granted. It is the duty of us all to ensure that every new generation of Australians, whether native-born or recently arrived, share those ideals. It is the fundamental duty of governments, parliaments, places of learning, and our civic and cultural institutions, and for us as fellow citizens, to fight to maintain the fire of liberty for which our diggers fought and died. And that is why it is right for our veterans on a regular basis to remind us that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Thank you very much.